She was 23 and homeless. No wages, no room, no family willing to open a door, just a canvas tool roll and $5 she had kept folded beneath her work gloves. And with that $5, she bought a forgotten wooden cigar-box maker's cabin outside Key West, Monroe County, Florida. A place dropped from county maps in 1971. The south roof sagged nearly 18 inches. 3 windows had no glass and the chimney leaned. Monroe County condemned it on March 3, 2022, with demolition planned for the following winter. But inside its rusted veneer press, a hollow chamber sealed beneath tons of old cast iron had remained unopened for decades, holding what would change her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Clara Mercer had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Homestead, Florida, she measured the safe places first, the narrow space beneath the kitchen table, the distance from her bedroom door to the back steps, the number of floorboards that would complain beneath bare feet after midnight. Her family never had much, and what they had seemed temporary. Furniture arrived from curbs. Shoes came from cousins. Rent was discussed in low voices at the sink. Her mother, Elaine, worked irregular shifts laundering hotel linens and believed survival meant never becoming attached to anything that could be taken. She kept bills in a flour tin, apologized to landlords before they complained, and taught Clara to pack a suitcase so tightly that nothing inside could move. The exception was Clara's grandfather, Elias Mercer. Every other Saturday beginning when Clara was 9, Elias collected her in a faded green Ford and drove her to his narrow workshop behind a house in Florida City. He repaired sash windows, cabinet doors, drawer runners, and old furniture that richer people considered too troublesome to save. His hands were broad and permanently darkened around the nails, yet he could shave a cedar edge so thin that the curl floated from the plane like a ribbon. Clara swept while he worked, then graduated to sorting brass screws, sharpening pencils, and holding a square against stock while he marked a cut. At noon, they ate tomato sandwiches on the back step. Afterward, Elias placed some damaged object on the bench and asked only, "What is it trying to tell you?" He said one thing often enough that Clara never forgot it: "Wood complains before it breaks if you listen." He was speaking about grain and pressure, but she understood years later that he had also been speaking about people. Elias died when Clara was 17 after a short illness that gave the family barely enough time to understand it had begun. His workshop was emptied before the funeral flowers wilted. Tools were sold in mixed lots. Lumber disappeared into pickup beds, and the old notebooks he kept beneath his bench were thrown into boxes no one could later locate. Clara managed to save one canvas tool roll because it had been left behind a cabinet. 6 years later, she worked at Sandline Architectural Millwork, north of Miami, repairing jigs and feeding stock through machines that were older than she was. The director, Warren Pike, wore pale shirts without sawdust on them and spoke softly when he wanted people frightened. Overtime vanished from payslips. Suppliers stopped delivering unless paid in cash. Pike locked the office whenever employees asked about missing retirement deductions. By October, Clara had begun noticing new equipment disappearing at night. By November, too, company trucks were gone. On December 2nd, Pike announced bankruptcy through a sheet of paper taped to the employee entrance and did not appear again. 4 weeks of Clara's wages went with him. Her rooming house landlord waited exactly 1 day. That evening, Clara returned to find her canvas tool roll standing beside the front door and her clothing packed into 2 grocery sacks. The landlord, Mrs. Bell, held out a crumpled $5 bill that had been part of Clara's deposit. Behind her, Elaine stood in the hallway. Clara had called her that afternoon and asked for 3 nights on the sofa. Her mother had said nothing then, and she said nothing now. Mrs. Bell pushed the bill toward her. $5 left. Take it and leave tonight. Clara looked past her at Elaine. Her mother lowered her eyes and tightened both hands around the strap of her purse. That was the answer. Clara put the $5 beneath the elastic band around her work gloves, lifted the grocery sacks, and walked into a night cold enough to silver the parked cars with frost. For 6 weeks she moved south because south required less heat. The first nights were spent in Miami sleeping upright in the 24-hour waiting area of a bus terminal until security began recognizing her. She washed in public library restrooms and bought one plain roll at a time from a bakery near Flagler Street. Her remaining change fell below $4. In Homestead, she slept behind a laundromat exhaust vent where warm air carried the smell of detergent across the concrete until 2 in the morning. A church volunteer gave her coffee without asking her name. She saved the $5 bill. Farther south, she spent 3 nights beneath a picnic shelter outside Florida City, wrapping the canvas tool roll inside her jacket so dew would not reach the steel. One morning, she counted 83 cents in loose coins. She spent 69 on a bruised banana and a day-old biscuit. The 5 stayed folded. She hitchhiked only when a woman or an older couple stopped. Otherwise, she walked. Her shoes split along one side near Tavernier. In Islamorada, she slept beneath the covered rear entrance of a closed bait shop, waking before the owner arrived. By the time she reached Marathon, she had 11 cents, the clothes she carried, Elias's tool roll, and the untouched bill. Rain drove her into the Marathon Public Library on a Tuesday afternoon. She sat near a newspaper rack because wet sleeves were less noticeable there. After an hour, when her hands had stopped shaking from the damp, she began reading notices pinned to a community board beside the copier. Most offered rooms she could not afford, boats she could not buy, and work requiring transportation she did not have. Then she saw a county disposal notice clipped beneath an advertisement for piano lessons. One line had been circled in blue ink. Abandoned structure for tax release. Wooden cigar-box maker's cabin and workshop. Monroe County parcel. AS's. $5. Buyer assumes condemnation liability. At the bottom, someone had handwritten directions to the clerk's office in Key West. Clara read the notice 3 times. The price looked like a mistake until she found the parcel number in an older county bulletin. The building had no utilities, no insured value, and an outstanding demolition order. Nobody wanted land that required hauling away a collapsing workshop. Clara touched the folded bill beneath her glove band. All her life, $5 had meant too little. That afternoon, for the first time, it meant exactly enough. She copied the parcel number onto the back of an expired library receipt, tightened Elias's canvas roll under her arm, and walked to the highway south. The $5 cabin was still 48 miles away. A Produce truck carried Clara 17 miles before dawn and left her beside the overseas highway with the Gulf lying dark and flat beyond the guardrail. She walked until the sun came up, then farther after it became hot enough for the torn edge of her shoe to rub the skin beneath her ankle raw. At a roadside stand south of Big Pine Key, an older woman gave her half an orange and pointed toward a farm lane where an open hay barn stood beyond a cattle gate. Clara slept there that night beneath a torn canvas tarp with loose hay stuffed around her coat and the temperature dropping to 48 degrees before sunrise. She woke with straw in her hair and the $5 bill still folded beneath the glove band. The next afternoon, she crossed onto Key West with salt-dried white at the cuffs of her trousers. Duval Street seemed almost indecently alive after weeks of parking lots and service roads. She passed Fausto's Food Palace, a narrow marine supply shop with propellers hanging in the window. A Cuban bakery breathing warm sugar through its doorway island hardware with hurricane shutters stacked against one wall, and a lunch counter called Doris's Cafe, where a chalkboard promised black beans and yellow rice for $4.75. Clara kept walking. Hunger could wait another hour. The Monroe County Clerk's office was cooler than she expected. Its floor smelled faintly of wax. A brass rail separated 3 service windows from a row of hard wooden chairs, and behind the middle window sat a woman with silver hair cut precisely beneath her ears. Her reading glasses hung from a black cord. The nameplate on the counter read, Margaret Hollis, Deputy Clerk. Clara slid the copied parcel number through the opening. Mrs. Hollis read it once, then looked at Clara. You understand there is no electrical service. Yes, ma'am. You understand the well has not been certified. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county has condemned the structure. Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition becomes your responsibility. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Hollis leaned back slightly. For perhaps 5 seconds, neither woman moved. Then Clara removed the $5 bill from beneath the elastic around Elias's old gloves and flattened it on the counter with 2 fingers. "I understand the price, too." Something almost became a smile on Mrs. Hollis's face, then disappeared. She pulled a thin folder from a cabinet and began preparing the transfer. The deed was only 3 pages. Clara signed her name 7 times while an overhead fan clicked unevenly above them. Mrs. Hollis checked every line with the edge of a steel ruler, then lifted a heavy brass date stamp, pressed it into a red pad, and brought it down with a dull mechanical thump. That sound changed the ownership of the building. Mrs. Hollis counted the $5 into the drawer and slid the deed back beneath the glass. "Take Wakehead to Truman, then east to Bertha. Follow Bertha until you reach Atlantic Boulevard. The old service lane is just past the drainage cut. You will see 2 walnut trees before you see the roof." Clara folded the deed once. Mrs. Hollis had begun closing the file when she stopped. "Mercer." Clara looked up. The clerk opened the folder again. "Your surname." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Hollis removed a yellowing index card that had been clipped behind the parcel record. She carried it closer to the window as if light might alter what was written there. "Did you know an Elias Mercer?" Clara's fingers tightened around the deed. "How was my grandfather?" Mrs. Hollis sat very still. "My father knew him." Clara said nothing. "He came here years ago asking about this parcel. More than once. Never bought it. Never filed anything. He would inspect the old maps, ask whether taxes had changed, then leave." "What year?" "Last time I remember was maybe 2014. Could have been 2015. That was only a few years before Elias died." Mrs. Hollis looked back at the card. "He told my father his people had worked cedar farther down the Keys before the roads were what they are now. Said there was one shop he wanted to see remain standing." Clara felt the room contract around the brass rail. "Did he say this was it?" "No." Mrs. Hollis turned the index card so Clara could see Elias's name written in blue ink along one margin. "But this is the parcel he kept asking about." Clara stared at the handwriting. She recognized none of it. The notation belonged to some clerk decades earlier, and Elias himself had left no message. Still, his name existed here in a government drawer she had never known about, attached to a ruin she had purchased with the last bill in her possession. Mrs. Hollis slipped the card into a plastic sleeve. "Take your deed." Clara did. "And take care before you decide what is worthless." Outside, the afternoon had turned bright and windy. Clara followed the directions east. The tourist streets thinned behind her until houses stood farther apart, and the smell of tidal mud came through the palms. On Bertha Street, an elderly man watering potted aloe watched her pass with the mild suspicion reserved for strangers traveling on foot. A brown dog beside him barked twice, then lost interest. "Looking for the Mercer place," the man called. Clara stopped. "I don't know yet." He pointed with the hose. "Past the walnuts. Leaning chimney." The dog sneezed in the spray. Clara thanked him and continued. The walnut trees appeared first exactly as Mrs. Hollis had promised, 2 old trunks twisted away from one another beside a narrow shell lane. Beyond them sat the cabin. It was smaller than the newspaper notice had made it feel, perhaps 26 feet long and 18 wide, built from cedar clapboards weathered nearly silver. Patches of rusted standing seam metal covered what remained of the roof. The south slope dipped visibly between 2 rafters. A short brick chimney rose through the western side at an angle that made Clara stop beneath it rather than walk immediately inside. Above the door, a wooden sign remained attached by one chain. Mercer and Daughters Cigar-Box Works. The surname had not been visible from the lane because lichen covered half the lettering. Clara touched the lower edge of the sign. The wood was soft at the corner but sound through the center. For the first time since leaving Miami, she set both grocery sacks down. The front door had swollen inside its frame. She pushed once with her shoulder, heard something drag across the floor, then pushed again until the bottom edge broke free with a shower of dry flakes. Cool air moved out. It smelled of wet cedar mouse nests, old glue, iron rust, and the sweet resinous trace of timber that had been shut away from sunlight for years. Clara entered sideways. Her first step raised dust. The front room held a workbench, 2 collapsing shelves, and hundreds of thin veneer leaves scattered over the floor like enormous brown feathers. Some snapped under their own weight when she lifted them. Others still bent. Paper, cigar-box labels hung from nails along one wall. Their red and gold inks faded into pale islands of color. She ran one finger across a bench and felt a ridge where repeated cutting had worn the surface lower than the surrounding wood. Somewhere behind the wall a lizard moved. Clara heard its claws before she saw its tail vanish beneath a cabinet. The back room was darker. There stood the Veneer press. It was nearly shoulder-high, made from black cast iron with two upright columns and a broad threaded screw descending from a wheel above. Rust had frozen the wheel in place. Beneath it rested a thick circular pressure platen scarred by glue and dark with oxidation. A cracked wooden call plate remained trapped beneath the screw, as if the last worker had stepped away expecting to return after supper. Clara laid her palm against the iron. It was cold despite the afternoon heat. Behind the press, rain had entered through a split in the roof and stained the wall almost black. She found an old enamel cup beneath a bench, a broken broom, and one empty flour sack that disintegrated when she tried to lift it. There was no bed. There was no running water. There was no electricity. By sunset, the room had begun filling with mosquitoes. Clara used a scrap of screen to cover the worst window opening, then swept a rectangle of floor with the broken broom. The bristles were uneven, but they moved enough cedar fragments aside to expose wide pine boards underneath. She spread her coat over them, placed Elias's tool roll beneath her head, and ate the last half of the orange from the roadside stand. Through the roof opening she could see a narrow triangle of evening sky. A gecko chirped twice from the wall. The building creaked whenever wind crossed the island. Clara listened. One board near the doorway answered with a long complaint. The southern wall gave a shorter one. The roof made almost no sound at all, which worried her more. She slept in intervals, waking whenever the temperature shifted or a branch touched the siding. Just before dawn, she opened her eyes to the smell of cedar. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then her hand touched the folded deed beside Elias's canvas roll. She rose, crossed the room barefoot, and stood before the rusted press, while early light came through the broken windows and touched the old iron one edge at a time. In the silence, the cabin no longer felt abandoned. In the darkness and under pressure, the cedar had kept its fragrance, refusing decay. On the first morning, Clara tied a strip of red cloth around the well handle so she would remember not to drink from it. The pump stood 20 yards behind the cabin beneath sea grape branches, its galvanized casing furred with rust. She worked the handle until brown water coughed into a bucket, waited, then pumped again. The second flow ran clearer, but smelled faintly of iron. She used it for washing tools and nothing else. The outhouse, farther back, had one sound hinge, 2 missing shingles, and a wasp nest beneath the seat that she removed after sunset, with a jar, a piece of cardboard, and patience. By the third day, she knew the floor. The long pine board beside the front bench groaned at its center. 2 boards near the press clicked together when weight shifted east. One narrow strip beneath the rear window gave a high, dry squeak no matter where she stepped. Clara began walking the cabin in darkness without striking a match, learning it the way she had once learned Elias's shop. She also learned that ownership did not produce tools. A chimney, brush lamp oil, nails, food, and enough hardware to make the door close properly required money she did not have. So she walked back to Island Hardware, carrying the canvas roll. The owner was a broad-shouldered man named Martin Vale, whose left thumb ended bluntly at the first knuckle. His store smelled of galvanized pipe rope, fertilizer, and old wooden drawers filled with screws that were still sold by weight. A ceiling fan turned slowly above bins of hurricane clips. Martin listened while Clara explained the cabin. How much cash? 11 cents. He glanced toward the tool roll. What can you do? Repair jigs, sharpen edge tools, set hand planes, some joinery. He placed a rusty Stanley block plane on the counter. Make that usable. Clara opened Elias's roll. 20 minutes later, she had flattened the iron on wet paper, honed the bevel, cleaned the throat, and adjusted the cap until a shaving curled from a scrap of pine, thin enough to read the price sticker through. Martin studied the shaving. Then he took a ruled account book from beneath the register. I don't loan money. I did not ask. I do extend store credit to people who work. Clara waited. $25. You pay when you can. If you leave town, I still sleep fine. He wrote Mercer, Clara on a blank line and handed her a dog-eared booklet titled Florida Home Repairs Roofs, Masonry, Windows, Floors. Free. The cover says 60 cents. It stopped being 60 cents before you were born. She bought only what could keep the cabin usable, a 4-inch chimney brush for $6.40, 50 feet of braided rope for $3.25, a pound of 8-penny galvanized nails for $2.10, lamp oil for $1.85, a steel scraper for $1.60, and a packet of stove matches for 45 cents. Martin added the total without comment. Clara carried everything home in a flour sack. The chimney occupied most of the next day. She did not light a fire until she knew what was above it. First, she removed the loose stovepipe and spread damp newspapers across the hearth. Then, she tied the brush to the rope, climbed onto the lower roof from a ladder borrowed from Martin, and lowered the brush into the flue from the top, rather than forcing old soot downward from inside. The first pull stuck. She twisted the rope, raised 6 inches, lowered 3, then worked the brush again. Black flakes began falling inside the hearth. By noon, the newspapers held almost 2 pounds of dry, creosote bird nesting and brick powder. A harder deposit remained along the upper bend, so Clara wrapped the rope once around her forearm and worked the brush in short strokes until the obstruction broke free with a hollow rush. She spent 4 hours on the flue and another 40 minutes checking joints with a candle flame for unwanted drafts. At dusk, she rebuilt the stove connection with the least damaged sections of pipe. The first fire was 3 cedar splinters over twisted newspaper, no more. She watched the smoke. It rose cleanly. Only then did she feed in 2 pieces of dry pine from beneath the workbench. The cabin changed with heat. Moisture lifted from the iron press and a mineral smell. Cedar warmed in the walls. Clara set the enamel cup on the stove with water from a jug Martin had filled for her, then stirred in cornmeal. Doris from the cafe had wrapped in paper after seeing Clara pass that morning. She ate hot mush with salt from the same cup. It was the first meal she had cooked indoors in nearly 2 months. The following morning she began inventorying the back room. Not everything deserved saving. She separated rot from neglect. The workbench had a maple top and iron vise with only surface corrosion. A foot-powered fret saw stood beneath a canvas cover, its treadle frozen but complete. 3 brass-bound wooden molds rested on a shelf, each sized for a different cigar-box lid. There was a drawer of tiny copper brads, green with oxidation at their heads, a lithographer's burnishing stone, 2 finger-joint gauges filed by hand, and a narrow cedar slicing frame with an adjustable fence that still moved when Clara cleaned its screw with lamp oil. The press was the heaviest object in the room. It also made the least sense. Clara spent an hour scraping glue from its platen. Beneath the hardened animal glue, she found concentric machining marks still visible in the iron. The central screw was nearly 3 inches thick. Its pressure wheel had 6 spokes, and every spoke ended in a rounded grip polished smooth by old hands. She tried turning it. Nothing. She warmed the screw collar with a cloth soaked in hot water, then added 1 drop of oil along the threads. She tapped the outer collar gently with the wooden handle of Elias's chisel. The sound was wrong. Not damaged. Hollow. Clara stopped. She tapped the left column. A thick dead note. The right column answered the same. She struck the cast iron flange beneath the threaded screw. Dense. Then she struck the center of the pressure platen. A low metallic ring moved through the room. She tapped the broad circular hub above it. The note changed sharply. Clara lowered the chisel. She tested again, moving around the hub in quarter turns. 3 positions sounded solid. 1 gave a faint chambered resonance as though a smaller piece of iron existed inside a larger shell. She crouched. Old presses sometimes had cavities in castings to reduce weight, but this one was designed to withstand enormous compression. The flange appeared solid, perhaps unnecessarily so. Clara scraped another layer of grime from the underside. A circular cedar disc emerged from beneath the dirt. It was no wider than the palm of her hand, and had been set flush into the cast iron so carefully that oxidation had nearly concealed its edge. She touched it. Wood inside iron. That was stranger still. Clara fetched the finger joint gauge from the shelf and slid its thinnest steel leaf along the circumference. The disc had no visible screw, no nail, no hinge. She pressed. Nothing. She weighed the press the only way available to her, not in pounds but by movement. She wedged a timber beneath one side of the base and pushed. The frame shifted perhaps an eighth of an inch. Then she repeated the test beneath the opposite side. The machine was heavier on the screw side by more than the casting alone seemed to justify. Clara sat back on her heels. Elias had once hidden spare cabinet keys inside hollow table legs because he said thieves searched drawers before they searched structure. She put both thumbs against the cedar disc and twisted. It moved a fraction. Clara stopped immediately. She cleaned the edge with the tip of a sharpened wooden splint, removing wax-like residue from the seam. Then she heated a rag beside the stove, pressed it to the disc for 30 seconds, and tried again. The cedar turned. 1/4 turn. Then half. A tiny alignment mark appeared where the wood met iron. Clara fitted the blade of a narrow putty knife beneath the edge and lifted. The disc came free. Behind it was darkness. She did not reach inside. Instead, she lit the kerosene lamp, placed it on the floor, and examined the cavity from several angles. The opening extended perhaps 14 inches into the hollow core of the flange. Something had been wrapped in oilcloth. Clara slid 2 fingers beneath the nearest bundle and drew it forward slowly. It was heavier than wood. The first package contained 3 tools: a small rosewood marking knife, with a blade polished nearly black from age, a pair of fine brass dividers, and a narrow shoulder plane no longer than her hand, its iron protected by waxed paper. Each bore the same tiny stamped mark, M&D, Mercer Daughters. Clara placed them on the bench. The second bundle contained cedar stock, not scraps, 6 pieces of Spanish cedar veneer, each scarcely 3 millimeters thick, separated by tissue and still giving off a dry, spicy fragrance when the wrapping opened. Alongside them lay a folded booklet sewn with linen thread. On its first page, written in brown ink, were the words, "Locked corner method, box joint without permanent glue." Clara did not turn the page. There was one package left. A rectangular tin box had been pushed to the deepest point of the cavity. She had to make a hook from copper wire to bring it within reach. The box was 12 inches long and dark green beneath its rust. Its lid was held shut by 2 wire loops. Clara straightened them carefully and lifted the top. Paper filled the upper half. Beneath the paper lay money. For several seconds she simply looked. Not modern bills. Old notes, rolled certificates, wrapped coins, and bank envelopes sealed in brittle wax paper. Clara closed the lid. Then she opened it again. The contents remained. She moved the box to the front room, where afternoon light was better, and cleaned a clear section of bench. She washed her hands. She dried them on the inside of her shirt because every other cloth was dirty. Only then did she begin. There were silver Morgan dollars, most worn at the edges. Walking Liberty $half wrapped in paper tubes. Indian head cents stored in a cotton sack, and several small gold coins protected individually between circles of cardboard. Mixed among them were currency notes of different ages, some large enough to feel almost theatrical compared with modern money. She counted the cash first, then the coins by face value, then again. The total came to $21,800, not $21,000, not $22,000, $21,800 exactly. Clara wrote the number on the back of the hardware receipt and checked every stack a third time. At the bottom of the tin box lay a small black presentation case. She opened it. Inside rested a World War I Victory Medal dated 1919, its rainbow ribbon faded almost gray at one edge. Beneath the medal was a single silver brad. It looked like the copper fasteners from the drawer in the workshop, except this one had been made from solid silver and polished before storage. Clara held it between thumb and forefinger. It weighed almost nothing. The last item was an envelope. Cream paper. Her name was not on it. Across the front in handwriting she did not recognize someone had written, "For the next hands willing to keep the work." Clara placed the envelope beside the lamp. She could have opened it immediately. Instead, she folded the money back into the tin exactly as she had found it nested, the metal case along the side, laid the cedar veneers flat beneath the oilcloth, and returned the heirloom tools to the bench. The envelope remained untouched. By evening the cabin seemed too small to contain what had happened. Clara walked through the back door and followed the path beyond the well until the ground lowered toward water. The tide was moving out. Mangrove roots stood exposed in the shallows. Farther west, a sailboat passed beyond the flats with no engine sound. Clara sat on a limestone block and watched its white shape cross the fading light. She did not calculate roofs. She did not calculate food. She did not calculate what $21,800 might buy. For one night, the unopened letter stayed inside the cabin. The water darkened. Behind her, cedar smoke left the chimney in a thin, straight line. In the darkness and under pressure, the cedar had kept its fragrance, refusing decay. At sunrise, Clara carried the envelope to the workbench and knew the handwriting before she understood why. The long, downward stroke of the M, the narrow, open loop in the R. The way the final letters of a word leaned toward one another as if sharing weight. Elias had written grocery lists that way. He had labeled drawer fronts that way. But the paper was older than he had ever been, and the signature waiting inside could not belong to him. Clara broke no seal because there was none. The flap had been tucked carefully beneath itself. She unfolded 4 cream pages along creases already softened by years. The first line read, "My dear one, whoever you are. If these pages have reached your hands, then the press has outlived me, and perhaps the shop has outlived nearly everyone who remembered what happened here. My name is Miriam Mercer. Dr. Samuel Ortega at Marine Hospital in Key West has told me the growth in my left lung cannot be removed, and that I should arrange what remains of my affairs." He said it kindly on October 11, 1971. I have discovered that kindness does not change the facts, but it does change how a person carries them home. Our family began this work with Thomas Mercer, who came through Charleston in 1868 and settled here 2 years later, repairing shipping crates before learning the cigar trade. His daughter, Abigail Mercer, born in 1874 in Key West, became the first of us to cut Spanish cedar thin enough for presentation boxes. Abigail's daughter, Ruth Mercer, born in 1898, worked the Veneer press through the First World War and kept the shop alive after her brother Daniel was killed in France in 1918. Ruth's son, Henry Mercer, born in 1921, taught my husband and later my son. I was born Miriam Mercer in 1925 and married Samuel Mercer in 1946. Our son Joseph learned the bench at 12 and was lost in Korea in 1951. After him, the sound of the shop changed. We closed the trade on June 17, 1940, only as a formal company, but the bench work continued privately for repairs. Small cigar houses and neighbors who still knew what a cedar box should smell like when opened. The last commercial order left this room on September 6, 1940. Since then, the name has lived mostly in memory, and by the time I write this, there have been more than 30 years of silence around the old methods. If you intend to use them, work carefully. Spanish cedar should be cut to 3 millimeters for veneer when the stock allows it. Warm, hide glue gently, and do not let it pass 145 degrees Fahrenheit, because overheated glue loses strength even when it looks unchanged. For the locking corners in the notebook, keep the finger depth at 1/4 of the board thickness and test every joint dry before you touch adhesive. When pressing veneer, 1 part glue to roughly 3 parts clean wood surface by working spread is enough. Too much glue makes a box heavy and dead. Leave a fresh pressing under steady screw pressure at least 6 hours in warm weather and 10 when the air turns damp. The silver brad is not valuable in any practical sense. My father made it after Joseph died because he could not speak that week. He filed it from an old spoon and said every shop ought to have 1 fastener that nobody would ever drive. The money was not hidden because money is sacred. It was hidden because work sometimes needs a quiet beginning. We saved it from years when orders were good from wood sold after storms from Samuel's wages and from what remained after Joseph's effects were returned to us. Spend it on a roof before a luxury on dry wood, before decoration on a sound hinge, before a polished sign. If you need food, eat. If you need medicine, buy it. A craft that requires its keeper to suffer unnecessarily is not honorable. Inheritance is not the keeping of old objects because they are old. It is learning why a joint held, why a worker chose 1 grain instead of another, why somebody sharpened a blade before putting it away for the night. Keep what still works. Repair what can be repaired. Let the rest teach you before you discard it. Behind the cabin, beyond the well, there is a low limestone marker beneath the older walnut tree. Samuel set it there after Joseph's death. If the roots have not moved it, you will find the same mark there that is stamped on the tools. That mark belongs to the work, not to any one person. I do not know your name. I do not know whether you are family. I hope that distinction will matter less after you have stood at the bench long enough. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Here to Abigail Mercer, November 6th, 1928. Clara reached the signature and kept her hand on the page. The stove had gone nearly cold. A strip of sunlight moved from the floor to the lower drawer of the workbench while she remained seated. Then she read the letter again. This time she stopped at Joseph's name, not because she knew him, because she had held the medal. The black case still rested beside the tin box, and now the worn ribbon had a body attached to it. A son who had returned only through his effects and the grief of people who continued sharpening tools afterward. Clara folded the pages along their original creases. She did not make new ones. The envelope went beneath Elias's canvas roll while she pulled on her shoes. Outside the morning was clear. She passed the well and found the older walnut tree by its split trunk. Its roots had raised the soil around one side and seagrass grew beneath its lower branches. Clara searched slowly, moving leaf mold with the side of her boot. The limestone marker was nearly buried. Only one corner showed. She knelt and cleared it by hand. The stone was roughly 12 inches square, weathered smooth at the edges. At its center, someone had carved the same small emblem stamped into the rosewood knife and brass dividers, an M crossed by a shallow cedar leaf. Below it were 3 initials, J.H.M. Clara sat back on her heels. No speech came. There was nothing to say to a stone that had waited longer than she had been alive. She brushed the loose sand from the carving and returned to the cabin. The silver brad lay on the bench where she had left it. She picked it up, polished its head once against the inside of Elias's canvas roll, and set it upright in a small drilled hole at the corner of the workbench, not driven, only standing. Then she took the kerosene lamp. It was an old heirloom object now, too, though no one had named it in the letter. The brass burner was black around its edges, and one side of the chimney glass carried a permanent smoke stain. Clara trimmed the wick square, filled its reservoir, and struck a match. The lamp came alive without drama. A yellow flame formed, steadied, and reflected once in the silver brad. That afternoon people arrived without arranging to. Martin Vale came first, carrying a paper-wrapped loaf and the replacement hinge Clara had priced but refused to put on credit. Found one in the back room, he said. She knew he was lying because the hinge was new. Mrs. Hollis appeared after closing time with a glass jar of drinking water and a photocopy of the oldest parcel map. Elias's name was not on the map, but Mercer Box Works had been penciled beside the lane in handwriting from another century. Doris from the cafe left a brown bag on the front step containing rice beans and 2 pieces of cornbread. The old man with the brown dog stopped at the walnut trees, raised one hand, and placed a bundle of dry kindling beneath the sign without entering. None of them asked what Clara had found. That mattered. A gift was different when it did not demand a story in return. Before we move on, think about one small kindness somebody once gave you when they did not have to. Maybe it was a meal, a ride, a quiet place to sit, or simply someone treating you as if you still belonged somewhere. If you remember one, tell us in the comments. Small kindness has a way of traveling farther than the person who gives it can see. That night, Clara wrapped the rosewood knife, brass dividers, shoulder plane, booklet, medal, silver brad, and letter in clean cloth and arranged them beside her bedding. She left the lamp burning low until the cabin grew warm. Then she lay down with Elias's canvas roll beneath her head and Miriam's words close enough to touch in the dark. The first snow came on December 4. Although in Key West it was only a freak coastal dusting carried south by a rare cold front. Scarcely an inch collecting in the shaded hollows before the sun began undoing it. Clara stood in the yard at dawn and watched white settle on the rusted roof seams. Then she went inside and read the roofing chapter of Martin's old repair manual for the 3rd time. The cabin measured 26 feet by 18, but the roof pitch added enough surface that she calculated just under 600 square feet of coverage. Allowing 10% for waste, she ordered 22 bundles of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 40 pounds of hot-dipped galvanized nails. She wrote the arithmetic twice in pencil before spending a single dollar from the cash. Martin delivered the material in his truck. He also placed a roofing hatchet on top of the shingles. The handle was dark hickory, the pole worn bright. "My brother's," he said. "He roofed 30 years, died in 98. I can return it." No. That ended the discussion. The skilled help arrived the following morning in the form of 72-year-old Wallace Green, a retired roofer with a white mustache and a left knee that bent reluctantly. He had heard about the cabin from Martin and refused payment before Clara offered it. "Teach me instead," she said. Wallace nodded. That arrangement he accepted. The southern sag proved worse once the metal skin came off. One rafter had split almost 6 feet along the grain. Wallace showed her how to sister it with a full-length pine member bolted tight to soundwood on either side of the break. They stretched a chalk line from ridge to eave, snapped it blue across the felt, and used the line to keep each cedar course honest. Clara learned the 3-stroke nail technique Wallace favored set-drive finish. Too hard and the shingle bruised. Too soft and the nail stood proud. On the 4th morning, Wallace tapped one with his hatchet. "That nail's proud." Clara reached for it. "Pull it." She did. The work lasted 11 days. Wind made the upper courses slow. One afternoon, rain forced them down after only 40 minutes. Another morning, Clara spent an hour trimming warped shingles rather than waste them. By December 15, the final ridge caps overlapped cleanly beneath a pale sky. Wallace climbed down first. Clara stayed on the ladder 1 extra minute, palm resting against the new cedar. That evening, rain came. She sat beneath the repaired south slope and listened. Nothing dripped. For the first time, silence from the roof was good. January belonged to brick. The chimney had not merely leaned. Its exposed western face had begun spalling outer layers, flaking away in thin red scales, while mortar beneath several joints had powdered to something Clara could scrape free with one fingernail. Wallace would not touch masonry. "Wrong trade," he said. Martin loaned her a tuck-pointing iron and found an old mason's handbook beneath his counter. Clara dismantled the loose upper courses 1 brick at a time, numbering salvageable pieces in pencil. She mixed hydraulic lime mortar in small batches and added fireclay near the flue, at roughly 3 parts lime sand mixed to 1 part fireclay, enough to tolerate heat without making the joints harder than the old brick. Temperatures stayed in the 20s on several mornings after a hard mainland cold front pushed south. Clara worked without gloves when setting joints because she needed to feel the mortar. Every 15 minutes her fingers went numb. She stopped, held them above the small stove, waited until they hurt again, then returned outside. Progress was slow. She reset no more than 6 or 7 bricks at a time, checking plumb from 2 directions and refusing to build on mortar that had not taken its first set. The lower stack needed repointing almost completely. Where powder had replaced the old joint, she raked back to firm material before packing fresh mortar in thin lifts. 3 weeks passed that way. By January 27, the chimney stood straight. Clara waited another 48 hours before testing it. She lit a twist of newspaper and held it beneath the throat. Smoke lifted immediately. Then she built a small pine fire. The draft remained clean, with no smoke escaping around the stove collar and no darkening along the repaired joints. She stayed beside the hearth until the last coal dimmed. Outside, the air was at 26 degrees. Inside, the old bricks held heat. The floors began as an argument between preservation and splinters. Most of the original boards were white pine wide enough that replacing them wholesale would have destroyed more history than it saved. Clara pulled only the pieces rotted through at their ends and patched those gaps with reclaimed white pine planks from a dismantled storeroom Martin knew about. The old boards had been fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails. She saved every usable one. New patches received salvaged nails where possible, driven through pilot holes so the brittle heads would not split the wood. For the surface, Martin rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. Clara planned 1 day. It took 2. The first pass was 80 grit, just enough to remove gray surface fibers and hardened grime without erasing every mark left by decades of boots and benches. The second pass at 120 softened the scratches. The final pass at 220 left the grain smooth, without turning the floor into something glossy and new. Dust entered everything. It found the lamp, chimney, the stove latch, the folds of her sleeves, and the tiny groove around the silver brad standing in the workbench. After vacuuming with a borrowed shop machine, Clara wiped the boards twice and laid down the first coat of oil. The wood darkened almost immediately. What had looked dirty brown became deep honey, then shifted toward mahogany as the second and third coats cured. She allowed 48 hours after the last application, walking only along scrap planks placed across the room when she needed to reach the stove. One morning she woke and could not make herself begin. Nothing had failed. No tool was broken. She simply stood at the back door with a cup of hot water and watched a great blue heron settle at the marsh. The bird remained nearly motionless for more than an hour. Clara remained too. She did no work that day. By evening, she stopped feeling the need to explain it. The next morning, she lifted the scrap walk boards and saw the restored floor unobstructed for the first time. Old saw marks still remained at the edges. A burn scar near the press remained black. She left both. 8 windows survived in some form. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held panes cracked from corner to corner. The 8th contained one original sheet, wavy and imperfect, its lower corner marked in old grease pencil with the date 1888. Clara did not remove that pane. She built every decision around preserving it. The replacement glass came second-hand from a salvage yard. She cut each pane 1/8 of an inch smaller than the sash opening, bedded it lightly. Set glazing points, then rolled damp 33 putty between both palms until it softened enough to work. The first bead looked clumsy. She scraped it out. The second was better. By the 5th window, she could draw the glazing knife through a continuous line and leave the bevel clean enough to shed rain. The sash cords were worse. Old cotton rope had turned brittle inside the weight pockets. Clara removed the access panels, vacuumed dead insects and plaster dust from the cavities, then threaded 1/4-inch cotton sash cord over each pulley. At the counterweight, she used a figure-8 knot pulled tight enough to seat, but not so tight that the fibers crushed. Each restored sash changed the room, not dramatically. A window that could open simply altered how air moved. A window that could close altered how night entered. The 7th took almost a day because the upper rail had twisted. Clara steamed it with towels heated over the stove, clamped it against a straight board, and waited until evening before fitting the glass. The original 1788 pane came last. She cleaned only its edges. The center remained slightly cloudy, filled with tiny distortions that bent the walnut branches outside into wavering lines. Clara fitted new cord to the sash without disturbing the old glass. As she tied the final figure-8 knot, something moved beyond the window. A chickadee had landed on the nearest walnut branch. It faced the cabin blackcap, bright against the pale morning, and remained there while Clara lowered the sash once, raised it once, then lowered it again. The counterweight moved without scraping. The window stopped exactly where she left it. Clara rested her fingers on the meeting rail. Outside, the chickadee flew. Inside, 8 windows held. The walls waited until the windows could keep weather out. Behind the damaged finish coat, Clara found hand-split oak lath with gaps wide enough for the original plaster keys to curl behind it. Much of the horsehair plaster remained sound, but the area surrounding the chimney had failed in broad, gray plates. Her first patch fell after 2 hours. The second cracked overnight. The third stayed on the wall until Clara pressed one thumb against the center and heard it separate from the lath. She carried the broken pieces to Martin. He disappeared into the rear stockroom and returned with an old burlap bag tied with electrical wire. "Horsehair," he said. "My father kept everything." The hair was clean, coarse, and pale brown. Clara mixed it into lime plaster a little at a time until the fibers separated through the batch, rather than forming knots. The scratch coat went directly through the lath and was scored while still green. She followed with a 3/8-inch brown coat leveled with a straight edge and left untouched for 72 hours. The finish coat was only 1/8 of an inch. She worked it in small fields, dampening the old edges first, so they would not steal moisture from the new lime. At the chimney, she stopped trying to hide every irregularity. Old wall met new wall visibly. Clara smoothed the final patch with a damp steel trowel and looked across the room. These patches will hold another 100 years. Nobody heard her. That was all right. Doris began leaving food without knocking. She was a short woman with a silver braid pinned tightly beneath a red scarf, and she folded every paper bag twice across the top before setting it on Clara's step. Some mornings the bag held Cuban bread and eggs. Other mornings it held beans, coffee, or bruised fruit from the cafe kitchen. When Clara finally caught her at the lane and tried to pay, Doris lifted one hand. "In candles when the shop reopens." Then she continued walking. Clara wrote the sentence on the inside cover of Martin's repair manual. Caleb arrived 3 days later on an old blue Schwinn. I was 16, narrow through the shoulders with hair that refused to stay beneath his cap. A splitting maul was balanced across the bicycle handlebars. My mother said, "About your grandfather." That was all he offered by way of explanation. He spent 2 hours breaking storm-fallen limbs into stove lengths, stacking the wood beneath the eave with the bark side up. When Clara held out money, Caleb looked at it as if she had offered him a wrench he did not need. He shook his head once. Then he rode home. Reverend Boyd never entered the cabin. I was tall, stooped slightly at the neck, and walked the same road each morning wearing a brown felt hat polished shiny at the brim by years of fingers. Each time he passed the walnut trees, he tipped the hat toward Clara. On mornings when she was outside, he added the same 4-word prayer: "Keep these hands steady." No sermon followed. No request followed. Clara began lifting one hand whenever he approached. In March, she made Doris 2 wooden candle trays from scrap pine. For Caleb, she sharpened them all. For Reverend Boyd, she repaired the loose ferrule on his walking stick. None of those exchanges balanced anything. They were not meant to. Clara postponed the cellar until February 11. The hatch stood beneath a bench in the back room, its iron ring almost flush with the floor. She had known it was there since the first week, but the stairs smelled damp, and the work above ground had always seemed more urgent. When she finally lifted the hatch, cool mineral air touched her face. 7 granite steps descended into a room 12 feet by 15. The walls were fieldstone. The floor was stone 2-fitted irregularly, except at the center where a dressed granite slab lay, perfectly rectangular amid the rougher pieces. Carved into its surface was the Mercer cedar leaf mark. Clara cleaned the groove with a brush. She did not attempt to lift the slab. Whatever lay beneath, if anything did, could wait. On the 3rd step, her lamp caught a straight line where no straight line belonged. An oak box had been wedged beneath the tread. It was small enough to fit beneath one arm and secured only by a corroded brass latch. Inside lay a key. The shaft was ordinary brass, but the bow had been filed into the shape of a cedar leaf split by an M. Beneath it was a tintype. Clara raised the photograph toward the lamp. A young woman stood outside the same cabin in summer light. The roofline was straighter, the clapboards darker, and the sign above the door looked newly painted. The woman held a small shoulder plane. Her face made Clara sit down on the granite step. Not identical, but close enough that the eyes, mouth, and shape of the jaw seemed borrowed from Clara's own reflection. On the back, written in faded ink, were 8 words. Ruth Mercer, daughter of Abigail, age 25, summer of 1903. Clara read it twice. She carried the photograph upstairs and set it beside Miriam's letter. The key went onto the mantel. She tried it in the front door, the tool chest, the press cabinet, and the old desk drawer. It fit none of them. For months afterward, the brass cedar leaf remained above the stove. Clara did not know what had opened. By March, the last cold mornings had loosened their hold. Water ran loudly through the drainage cut after rain. The tidal creek behind the cabin filled and emptied with a sharper voice, and the walnut branches produced pale catkins that shook whenever wind came across the flats. Clara could have begun making boxes. She did not. The inheritance notebook remained on the workbench open to the locked corner drawings while she practiced on scraps. She decided that spring would be for learning. 1 coin from the cash bought Spanish cedar thin poplar core stock, fresh hide glue, and several sheets of abrasive paper. She cut samples no larger than her palm and learned how grain tore when she hurried the knife. She learned what too much glue looked like beneath pressure. She learned why Miriam had written that a dry fit should happen before adhesive touched anything. Some joints failed immediately. Others looked sound until the next morning. Clara kept those, too. The failed samples accumulated in a drawer beneath the bench, each marked in pencil with the reason. April brought warmer evenings. She opened all 8 windows. The cedar smell moved through the rooms and out toward the walnut trees. There was no deadline now. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Clara finished the first box she was willing to call complete. It was not ornate. The body was poplar beneath 3mm Spanish cedar veneer, pressed beneath the restored cast-iron screw for 8 hours. The corners followed Miriam's locking pattern, tiny, interleaving fingers cut by hand and tested dry until the joint closed without forcing. Clara used hide glue only where the old notes allowed it and set 6 nearly invisible copper brads along the underside. The lid closed with a low breath of displaced air. She opened it again. Cedar rose from the interior. For a long time, Clara stood with both hands resting on the bench. Then she turned the box over and marked the bottom with the old stamp, M&D. The restored cabin around her had changed without becoming new. The white pine floor still carried its burn scar beside the press. Lime plaster walls showed faint waves where old work met repair. 8 windows opened and closed. The chimney drew cleanly. Shelves held sharpened tools instead of mouse nests. The old Veneer press stood in the center of the back room, black iron rubbed with a thin coat of oil. Its hidden cedar disc returned to the flange, but no longer sealed. On the mantel sat the brass key. For almost 2 years it had opened nothing. Then, one January morning, Clara noticed a rectangular discoloration on the older walnut tree. She was pruning dead growth from a low branch when sunlight crossed the trunk at an angle and revealed 4 small brass screw heads beneath lichen. She fetched a brush. A plate emerged from the bark. It had been fitted so long ago that the tree had grown around its edges. At the center was a keyhole. Clara returned to the cabin without running. She removed the cedar leaf key from the mantel, wiped its shaft once on her sleeve, and carried it outside. It entered halfway. She turned it gently. Something released inside the trunk with a dry click. The brass plate opened outward on a concealed hinge. Behind it was a narrow cavity lined with tin. Clara reached in and drew out an oilcloth bundle. Inside lay a folded 48-star American flag. Its cotton was yellowed along the creases, and one blue corner had been repaired by hand with dark thread. Wrapped within the flag was a note dated May 30th, 1918. The handwriting belonged to Ruth Mercer. Daniel is in France now. Mother says not to imagine the worst because imagination can become another kind of fear. I have placed this flag here because Daniel said the shop should keep something of him that was not a uniform. If he returns, I will show him where it is. If he does not, whoever finds it should understand that he was a cabinet maker before he was a soldier. His hands knew cedar before they knew a rifle. Remember him that way first. Ruth Mercer, May 30, 19 Clara lowered the note. The walnut leaves moved overhead. Daniel had not returned. The letter inside Miriam's envelope had told her that much. For more than a century, Ruth's flag had remained inside the tree because nobody who knew where to look had come back for it. Clara did not frame it. She did not place it behind glass. She folded it again along its old creases, wrapped Ruth's note inside, and carried both to the workbench. The military medal from the press belonged to another war and another generation. On July 27, 2025, the anniversary of the Korean armistice, Clara carried Joseph Mercer's medal to Key West Cemetery. Mrs. Hollis had helped locate the family plot. There was no ceremony. Clara cleaned the stone with water and a soft brush, placed the metal case beneath Joseph's engraved name for 1 hour, and sat beside it while cicadas sounded in the trees. Before leaving, she returned the medal to its case. It belonged at the shop. The cash had changed much less than Clara once imagined it would. She used 3 gold coins and 2 silver pieces sold carefully through a reputable dealer to pay for essential materials, county fees, electrical work, and the roof. The rest remained intact. Clara replaced the brittle wrappers with archival envelopes, but preserved every notation. She stored the money inside a fire-resistant steel box mounted beneath the old workbench. On its lid she wrote only, "For the next one." She did not calculate what the collection might someday be worth. Miriam had already explained what it was for. By the second winter, people had begun asking whether Clara would sell boxes. Her answer stayed no until Doris intervened. One morning, Clara entered the cafe and found an index card pinned to the corkboard near the register. Mercer Daughters, Cigar-Box, repairs and small orders, ask Doris. Clara stared at it. Doris kept wiping the counter. "You said candles," Clara said. "I changed the price. The first order was a repair. The second was a plain cedar keepsake box. The third came by mail from Marathon." Within 6 months, Clara kept a handwritten mailing list in a school notebook. There were 43 names. She accepted only what she could finish without hurrying. Some months that meant 6 boxes. Some months it meant 2. Nobody waited because she promised speed. They waited because the work was careful. Caleb returned in October carrying something wrapped in an old bed sheet. I was taller now and rode a pickup instead of the blue Schwinn. Without explaining, he leaned the wrapped object against the cabin wall and removed the cloth. It was a carved cedar sign, Mercer and Daughters. The lettering followed the faded original exactly, but Caleb had added a smaller line beneath it, and Daughters. Clara looked from the sign to him. There were already daughters. I know. Then why add it? Caleb rubbed his thumb along one carved edge. So nobody forgets. He had cut the letters too deep in one place. The final S leaned slightly. Clara noticed both defects. She said nothing. Together, they hung the sign beneath the old one rather than replacing it. The original remained above, cracked and faded. The new cedar hung below. For a while, 2 generations of lettering moved in the same wind. That winter, Clara began a letter. She used cream paper. The first sheet remained blank for 3 evenings while she sharpened tools, swept the floor, and closed the windows one by one. On the 4th evening, she sat beneath the lamp. She wrote, "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped. There was no reason to hurry the rest. She knew what she wanted the future reader to understand, but understanding had taken her years, and she did not intend to flatten those years into instructions written in one night. Over the following months, she added pages. She wrote about Martin's credit ledger, about Doris's paper bags, about Wallace and the roofing hatchet, about Caleb splitting wood without accepting money, about a clerk who preserved an index card rather than throwing it away. She wrote measurements, too. 3 millimeters, 145 degrees, 8 hours under pressure when humidity was high. She described the sound of a good joint closing. She described the sound of one beginning to fail. At the bottom of one page she wrote Elias's sentence. Wood complains before it breaks if you listen. She did not explain it. Some sentences carried enough weight alone. By 2026 the veneer press worked again. Not perfectly. Its screw still tightened harder through the final quarter turn, and Clara refused to machine the threads smooth because the resistance told her where pressure began. Each time she pressed cedar, the warm wood released the same dry fragrance she had smelled on her first night. In the darkness and under pressure, the cedar had kept its fragrance, refusing decay. One late afternoon, Clara finished sweeping and opened the back door. The creek was low. A great blue heron stood near the mangrove edge, almost where the earlier bird had stood years before. On the workbench, a new Cigar-Box waited beneath a linen cloth. Beside it lay Miriam's letter, Ruth's tintype, Joseph's medal, Elias's canvas roll, and Clara's unfinished pages. She turned the lamp down. The workshop darkened gradually rather than all at once. Outside, the newer sign moved beneath the old one. The wooden cigar-box maker's cabin waits, it has always waited. And in a drawer at the Monroe County Clerk's office, Margaret Hollis still kept one ordinary $5 bill beneath the old parcel card. She had replaced it with $5 of her own when closing the register that afternoon years earlier. The original bill remained folded once through the center. On the paper sleeve around it, Mrs. Hollis had written a date, a parcel number, and 2 words. First payment. No one displayed it. No one told Clara. Some things were kept not because they needed an audience, but because somebody had decided they should not disappear.